Welcome to our Just Talk, Talk Just panel discussion. Stony, the Road We Trod, the Legacy of Racialized Trauma. Sponsored by the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation and the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Our panelists are Dr. Paula Parker, Program Associate for the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. Dr. Eric Williams, Curator of Religion at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. And the Reverend Phanta Lansden, Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation Advisory Board member and pastor of St. James Presbyterian Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. Our moderator is the Reverend Melanie C. Jones, Director of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and Instructor of Ethics, Theology, and Culture at Union Presbyterian Seminary. Reverend Jones, over to you.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Just Talk conversation. We are so glad that you are joining us for this timely conversation. On January 16, 2023, the nation recognized the 55th anniversary of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., a 39-year-old dreamer whose quest for justice, truth, and racial equality was stunted by white vitriolic hatred. In America's duplicitous psyche, King did not die a hero. In fact, at the time of his death, he was known to many as the most hated man in America. But he only became America's martyr in efforts to sanitize its history of racialized violence and trauma. If past is prologue, in the Shakespearean logic, then time past does not simply mean progress. In recent times, we have witnessed public outrage about the teaching of critical race theory in schools that some would simply argue is a decry of not CRT, but rather more broadly, the study of African American history and culture. Just this week, Florida's Department of Education rejected an advanced placement course covering African American studies with claims that the course indoctrinates students to a political agenda. According to Brian Griffin, Governor Ron DeSantis' press secretary, as reported by the NPR, the course, quote, is a vehicle for a political agenda and leaves large, ambiguous gaps that can be filled with additional ideological material, which we will not allow, end quote. I'm sure you are wondering, like me, exactly whose ideology, or better yet, whose political agenda is in play when courses like these are rejected. The basic ideological assumption for the inclusion of an AP course in African American studies to any curriculum is that the experiences of African descended peoples in the United States matter, and that our voices shape any real discussion of American history that reveal both terror and triumph. Welcome again to tonight's Just Talk, Just conversation entitled Stony, the Road We Trod, the Legacy of Racialized Trauma. We welcome panelists Dr. Eric Williams, Reverend Phanta Lansden, and Reverend Dr. Paula Parker. Tonight's panel will chart connections between history and racialized trauma, and we hope to engage ways faith leaders, congregations can address racialized trauma in the U.S. and in their local communities. This is the fourth of our year-long series focusing on the church's involvement in shaping a racialized America and how the church can also reshape the future. Let me introduce our panelists. Welcome, Reverend Dr. Paula Parker. She is the Program Associate for the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership and the senior developer of Roots Matter LLC, a program which identifies approaches to healing generational trauma in families and communities. Dr. Parker is the developer of RAFA, a course in contemplative healing prayer, a spiritual director, and a certified facilitator of emotional emancipation circles of Community Healing Network, a member of the advisory board of the Spiritual Directors of Color Network, and a presenter for the North Carolina Institute for Spiritual Direction and Formation. Dr. Parker is the author of Roots Matter, Healing History, Honoring Heritage, Renewing Hope, which recognizes the impact of transgenerational trauma as a result of chattel slavery on the African American community. She has contributed articles to Healing Line, Christian Century, and Interpretation, a journal of Bible and theology, and co-authored the chapter Internal Liberation in Kaleidoscope, Broadening the Palette in the Art of Spiritual Direction. Welcome, Dr. Parker.
Thank you.
Next, we have Reverend Phanta Lansden, who is a native of Morganton, North Carolina, and a 2016 graduate of Union Presbyterian Seminary, as well as a recipient of 2 awards: the Helen Dean Preaching Award, given to students who exhibit promise for effective preaching in the church, and the James Elizabeth Appleby Book Award, given to those whose commitment to Christ and spiritual promise indicate particularly fruitful pastorates to the glory of God. She is currently enrolled as a doctoral student at Union Presbyterian Seminary, pursuing a DMin degree focused on healing trauma from a spiritual perspective. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Social Work from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and has worked in the field of social work for over 10 years. She comes with a wealth of knowledge and experience working with marginalized populations and continually strives to advocate for the rights, dignity, and well-being of all people. She is a wife, a mother, a social worker, a pastor, and a philanthropist. And she lives by the Proverbs 3, 5, and 6 passage, trusting in the Lord with all her heart, and dedicated her life to serving God and others with love and compassion. Welcome, Reverend Phanta. Last, we have Dr. Eric Lewis Williams, who is a native of Rockford, Illinois, holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Communications and Sociology from the University of Illinois at Chicago, a Master of Arts degree in Theological Studies from McCormick Theological Seminary, the Master of Divinity degree from Duke University, and a Doctorate of Philosophy and Religious Studies from the University of Edinburgh in the United Kingdom. Williams has taught religion, history, and African American studies at several institutions and currently serves as the curator of religion for the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. His current research examines the meaning of religion within African American history and culture and the role and influences of African religions within the Atlantic world. William is the co-editor of the Handbook of African American Theology and is currently completing a manuscript which explores the theological significations, in African American Pentecostal thought. William considers himself a transatlantic commuter, a collector of words, and an emergent jazz man in the world of ideas. Welcome, Dr. Williams. Now that the roll has been called, we have an expert panel of amazing folks to have this important conversation and dialogue. Again, we are focusing in on the legacy of race and trauma in this nation. And I want to pose that first question to Dr. Williams. Give us an understanding or define for us historical trauma, and from a historical perspective, how you might describe the legacy of race and trauma in the U.S.
So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight with this wonderful panel of healers and freedom fighters. I'm very grateful to be here with you and to be back at Union Presbyterian. Thank you for having me. So, as it relates to this notion of historical trauma, this notion seeks to capture kind of multi-generational trauma experienced by groups, cultural, racial, ethnic groups that leave a kind of sustained wound that continues, and that those who are in the lines of those who've experienced these forms of trauma, they are left to work against. And I'm thinking of, in particular, the work of Dominic LaCapra. It talks about, we talk about the founding traumas. And when you think of the founding traumas of this nation, there's no real account of our nation that can be given, no true account anyway, that does not take into consideration these wounds that are at the very base of the American narrative, which was the treatment of the indigenous people who populated this land, and of course the involuntary presence, the forced capture and the enslavement, the deep systemic dehumanization of African peoples in this country. When we think about the ways in which it continues now, because of slavery, what Orlando Patterson calls natal alienation, this with the separation of families, lynching, and microaggressions, Black people in this land have to be ready for the next assault. It's almost, as the young people would say, our heads are almost always on swivel, because we don't know where the next attack is coming from. And it's just a hyper consciousness. You just, sometimes it leaves you wondering what people mean by what they say. And so we often find ourselves saying, excuse me, can you repeat that again, please? Because you don't know if they're coming at you or if you're responding to something else. And so it affects us in our movement in the world in very profound ways, and we shouldn't have to live like this.
I think that's helpful as a framing for us. Dr. Paula, can you map the ways that this trauma historically has impacted us generationally? What's the relationship between generational trauma and racialized trauma?
Well, first, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. And I want to start with trauma itself and what it is. And then my definition is that it is frightening thoughts or painful memories or physical distress that's caused by an experience of threat, injury due to violence, natural disasters, accidents, intimidation, betrayal, long-term stress. And when a person is traumatized, they are overwhelmed by whatever that event was, and they end up having to accommodate or change their lives in order to incorporate that trauma. It changes you physically, spiritually, emotionally. And one of the other things that it does, a traumatic event, because that's what it is, the trauma is what's left over that we live with, shatters people's basic assumptions about life. So it's about life, self, and other people. So the three basic assumptions that get shattered with trauma is life is fair, life is predictable, and people are good. And that causes a crisis of meaning and a crisis of faith. And when we have traumas that happen to us, what we seek is to reorder our lives so that we have the stability, we have meaning and order. One of the things that was most recent video was a movie was Katrina Babies, which is an example of a trauma that is still being lived out that happened with Katrina when they looked at the children who had not even ever been asked about how they felt about it. But trauma is about loss. And it's the loss from natural disasters or human violence, mental illness, emotional illness, physical illness, and spiritual crisis. And the most traumatic of all of them is human violence, human to human violence. So if you're looking at racial trauma, if you're looking at, like Dr. Williams said, if you start with the capture in Africa, the forced march to the slave dungeons, the Middle Passage, and then getting here, all of those are compounded by the time they get here with different kinds of trauma that are definitely not being addressed. And then get here, and you have the separation, you have the physical, the emotional, and spiritual abuse that they endured, and none of it is processed, not in any way acknowledged. It's all suppressed. So if you look at, and I want you to realize, for us to be here, for you to be here today from 12 previous generations, we're talking 4,094 ancestors in the last 400 years for you to be here. So think about that as how many struggles, how many battles, how much difficulty, how much sadness, but at the same time, how much happiness and love and expressions of hope had to be expressed for you to be here. And there had to be resilience for us to be here. So even though there was trauma in their lives, and generational trauma, because 400 years is about 20 generations. And it's 12 generations that were in chattel slavery. 158 years has been out, which is about 7 generations since 1865. And for us to be equal to the 246, that year is 2111 is when we will be 246 years out from 1865 and the release of slavery and the end of formal slavery. So generational trauma, and in our lifetime, and for us as African Americans, and racialized trauma are the same. And if you think of a double helix, with one spiral being genealogy or your family or your ancestors, and the other one being historical context, you can see how they're connected, and they're connected through story and interpretation of story. How they lived and when they lived make a difference. And cultural trauma occurs when members of a collective feel like they've been subject to a horrendous event, such as slavery, and it leaves an indelible mark on the group consciousness. So racialized trauma for us as African Americans, for most, I would say 99.99% of us, racialized trauma and generational trauma are the same because they are embedded one in the other.
Yeah, that's helpful. Dr. or soon to be Dr. Dr. Lansden, I know that you've been thinking about this as well in terms of healing, and particularly in the context of congregations. As a pastor, what is the impact of racialized trauma on congregations in particular?
Well, first, thank you so much for the invitation to be a part of this conversation, and with this esteemed panel, two persons that I definitely look up to and are excited about the work that they are doing in this area. So for me, it is the combination of the two conversations that we just had around the generational trauma and the historical trauma. But first, when I think about racialized trauma, I consider Racism, racial discrimination, racial bias, oppression due to race, hate crimes, and any sort of injury that comes to people of color. And so with that understanding, racial trauma happens regularly, daily, all the time in our communities. On a micro and macro level, both are harmful. And unfortunately, the trauma is passed down from generation to generation in the Black community. And racialized trauma in America can be seen in the life of Africans, as we talked about, who were enslaved and brought to America through the horror of the Middle Passage. Dr. DeGruy talks about the post-traumatic slave syndrome and the effects that it has on multiple generations of enslaved Africans and the lingering effects, the historical memory of our genetics that happens. In her book, I want to quote her. She says, recent research in the field of epigenetics have revealed that trauma can actually impact an individual's DNA, and the manifestation of the traumas experienced by prior generations can be passed along genetically to future offspring. So as Black people, we have the historical and generational trauma impacting us along with the present day of the personal traumatic experiences that happen and change our lives. The racialized trauma and otherwise, in 2020, when Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd were murdered, Barbara Holmes talks about this incident in her book, Crisis Contemplation, Healing the Wounded Village. And she says, during the recent viral and racial pandemics, ancestral trauma safely stored in my genes erupted and rose in my throat like bile, an unsettling context for contemplation, end quote. So events that happen in our present day realities have the ability to trigger or unearth past traumas, historical traumas, and we are re-traumatized or invited to revisit the horror again. When we see the images and the words and the sounds and the memory, they are stored in our bodies and we are triggered. Therefore, racialized trauma impacts Black congregational life because it impacts the people. It changes the way the people show up in certain settings. It can impact the person's behavior, interactions with others, coping skills, communication or lack of, and how we value ourselves and the amazing amount of things that we have to offer. Again, Barbara Holmes quotes Kenneth V. Hardy in his book, Healing the Hidden Wounds of Racial Trauma, Reclaiming Children and Youth. And he says, racial oppression is a traumatic form of interpersonal violence, which can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. Y'all, it's understood that in Black congregations, everyone has either experienced a trauma firsthand and or they are living with generational trauma stored as it penetrates the mind, body, and soul. So a part of my DEMON work has been to look at avenues that help address and aid in healing from trauma. In the same way people of color and culture carry a common story, we carry these common stories, not the same story, but common stories. So I believe it's in community that we can heal. And we hear Resmaa Menakem in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, talk about the gift of collective and communal healing. And so as I was doing the research and digging in and discerning with the spirit on what God would have me to do centered on trauma, I talked with a couple of people who are doing the work. And the main part about leading congregations through trauma, whether it be through the liturgy or rituals or other conversations, it has to begin with breaking the silence, speaking about the elephant in the room, calling out the struggle. And so my DEMON project is entitled Breaking the Silence, Trauma-Informed Preaching and Spiritual Practices that Aid in Healing the Black Community. And as I began to preach and really just talk about the struggles of our community and people, it just began to open up space. The preaching is what broke the silence, but it also gave space for us to consider and address the theologies sometimes that had bound us to think that God may have wanted this to happen or desired us to suffer, be traumatized, but that's not the truth. It's offering a theology of healing, of liberation, of repair. And so that was one avenue. And the second avenue was spiritual practices, which the spiritual practices are the way in which we connect with the Spirit, and God takes us deeper into our individual stories and helps us to unearth the pathways towards healing, the resilience that we also, as Dr. Parker talked about, that we gain from our ancestors and the reason that we are here. So these are avenues. I can continue to talk about this, but one thing I do want to notate is that as I was doing the Demon Project, I realized that, and as a social worker and as a pastor, you had to have healthy ways in which you create an environment where people felt cared for from a pastoral sense. So Stephen Ministry was a part of the ways in which we cared for the congregation throughout the series, the preaching series, the small groups, the conversations, because Stephen Ministry is a caregiving ministry within congregations that support people in the times of loss, or just walk alongside people to provide one-on-one distinctive caregiving, Christian caregiving. So before I preached, I said that if you are triggered in your body, and I mentioned what that looked like, if your heart starts racing, if your palms start sweating, if you begin to have these revisiting of memories, there is a place to care for you. There's a place during service, after service, and I also provided resources for the community. If you leave this building, you need to talk to someone. There's therapy. There is myself, if you need to talk with me. There's also space. So a part of guiding congregations through the healing process is, number one, talking about a trauma-informed theology, spiritual practices that allow people to connect with the divine in a deep way and have those individual conversations, and then the care that's needed to go through the journey.
Thank you, Reverend Lansden. So powerful and poignant. I think as you were talking, I was kind of having reactions or responses to the kind of contemplation and the quote that you were talking about, how it moves through one's body, how it becomes embodied in many ways. Can either of you, in your various ways or entry points, what are some ways in which this trauma manifests physically for people who are often affected by it?
Well, I mean, it could be hypervigilance, it could be distrust, it could be through the body, it could be arthritis, autoimmune disorders, hypertension, those stress related tension, because you're carrying not only what you have experienced, but you're carrying your family and your generational. So depression is another one that manifests with generational trauma. And what I have found is when you can talk about it, when you break the silence and people begin to understand that it is not all their fault, that they are not, that there's nothing truly wrong with them. They're carrying a lot of history as well as constant re-traumatization every day. And once you even begin to understand that, and that you're okay, and God is there with you and will help walk you through it and heal you from it, that in itself is healing. Just understanding how it's working in your body and in your family and the family dynamics. When you start looking at generational trauma, and I use in the work that I do, I use the genogram to track not only the traumas and patterns of trauma, but also the patterns of resilience. And so that can help with the healing process. But mental illness is very, very prevalent in the generational healing and trauma, generational trauma.
Dr. Williams, I'm thinking about your research, particularly in relation to COVID and bodies, not necessarily embodiment, but the way in which, COVID bodies were marked, or bodies were marked by COVID as a result of racialized trauma. Can you speak to that? You're muted, I think.
Sorry. Thank you for that. So yes, you made reference to the work that I've been kind of looking at of late around even attitudes around the reception of healthcare because of the trauma that had been visited upon the Black bodies. And I'm not talking about Tuskegee, but during slavery, all of the experimentation that was done on Black bodies, using the teeth of enslaved persons for dentures, actually, for the colonial settlers, doing things like the domestic cadaver trade, where they were going and the resurrection men, as they called them, would exhume these bodies and sell them to these hospitals and these major medical training institutions that I could name them and you would know them today. And so, which even caused the enslaved Africans to have to find new ways of memorializing and burying their dead because they wanted them to rest in peace. But then I'm also thinking about the work of Saidiya Hartman on the afterlives of slavery and how how the traumas of enslavement and those legacies, we see them in the healthcare system and who has access and who doesn't. And so it's quite broad and sweeping, but it is all over the place. And I really appreciate, Dr. Parker, your comments along these lines. It was very powerful and enlightening.
Thank you.
We're already getting questions from folks who are watching, so I'm going to jump in. I see our former Dean Richard Boyce asking a question, I think to Reverend Phanta, in your discussion about preaching as a kind of liturgical practice by which folks can be invited to kind of deal with their trauma or confront traumas. What approaches to preaching open up versus close down this space, this healing space that you speak of?
So I think that telling personal stories open up a space for people to reflect on their personal story, but also connect it to the biblical story. Brené Brown talks about how vulnerability creates connection and connection creates community. And so in those spaces where you're able to be vulnerable and share your journey of trauma, it will connect with someone. And then you share maybe a story of the traumas that we find in scripture. Mine was John 4, the woman at the well, and the ways in which God heals through those traumas. That opens people up. But if you're not able to be open yourself and share your story, it can oftentimes also close people.
It seems like there's an invitation to open oneself to also be vulnerable in the space, but also this kind of shared connection that makes it possible for people to also confront the traumas that they too might face. I am curious as I see things are coming in. I'm asking folks to drop your questions as well. But I want to speak to the role of faith, particularly in how we think about race and trauma. How do we understand, or how do you understand the role of faith in this legacy of race and trauma that we're mapping tonight? It's open.
I'll go. I was thinking about the church. Actually, I was thinking about a study of a gentleman by the name of Joseph Clemens, who wrote a doctoral project on ecstasy and wholeness, where Clemens talks about the therapeutic effects of worship, and that the church, of course, being the Black church, being a place where the community could come and together, but even against the backdrop of a cruel world, that the church becomes this place where people can gather and to be human and to be seen and to be heard against a context where one is rendered invisible, nameless, and inaudible, but also the resources within the tradition, prayer, the experience of praise and worship, and I'm thinking about people like Zora Hurston and her text, The Sanctified Church, Du Bois's idea about when he talks about in Souls of Black Folk, when the Spirit of the Lord passed by, seizes a devotee and makes him mad with supernatural joy. That in the experience of worship, there is this sense that one that God restores and God heals and God strengthens and God empowers to go back out into a world that is often cruel.
I agree. I would like to. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Parker.
No, I was just going to say that fortunately for us, our ancestors brought the understanding of God as immanent and right as part of your life, and is close and immanent to you, and also believed in the worth of themselves, that they had the divine within. And I think that they held on to that, and we still see that now. In the God is near, and God will help you through, and God will open doors. So there's an immanence that is part of our faith, as well as an understanding that there is a divine spark in each of us. It might be covered up with a lot of mud and trauma but we all have it. And because healing happens best in community, even if it's in community, it can be 3 people, it can be 2 people. But if healing can happen in that way that you share your stories, and in sharing your stories, you're healing each other.
I wanted to jump in and say, talk about the music or the rhythms of worship and the cadence of worship, and just praise, dance, and all of that. That is a part of our faith, but also our healing, because we know that trauma lodges in our bodies, and the faith is connected, and the faith in the movement or the shout, the praise dance is connected to our healing, which is connected to God, but we're also healing ourselves by releasing the trauma in the midst of that dance, or of the way in which we connect with God through the music, through the rhythms of the music. You think about the humming and the cadence of the humming and the bows of the ship. It was the music that sustained and carried in part of that resilience. So I think that there's a large connection around faith and healing that brought people through the trauma, the racialized trauma, and continues to help us sustain now.
Janet Mullins, who's joining us online, asks, how can the church embrace persons who are experiencing trauma without judging them? And I'm recognizing that often there's a stigma, social stigmas that are often attached to these experiences of trauma. And how can the church obviously embrace without maintaining those stigmas?
I think that it begins with creating a culture within congregations where people are embraced for the way that they show up. So there's a South African welcome, this sayubone, and it means I see you. I see the whole of you. I see all of you. You're welcome to come into this space. So I think if churches embrace the notion of all are welcome, and we also all come with our scars and with the various things that have happened to us, but we are not what has happened to us, then we can create cultures that embrace and nurture people for who they are. And it may seem simple, but it's complex because we come into a culture where some are in and some are out. And whatever that rule stick is. But I think it begins with pastors saying, this is the trajectory, or this is the vision, and then creating that culture that is healthy for people to come and be themselves.
And I think part of that also is some type of teaching and education with the congregation so that they know how to receive. Because I think, and it has been my experience, that sometimes people can see that someone is hurting, but they don't know what to do to be there for them, or how to be there for them. And so I think that having the preaching and having backup teaching and learning skills about how to do it, your spiritual formations or whatever, can create that culture that is open and embracing. And because the one thing you don't want to do is to re-traumatize somebody that's coming into the church. So there has to be some level of awareness, education for the congregation to be able to recognize and know, if it's nothing else, but I know who to send you to. I know where you need to go. Those kinds of things.
I'm recognizing that folks who are joining us tonight might occupy churches outside of, or congregations outside of Black church context. And I'm wondering, particularly in white church spaces, how there might be ways or pathways to begin to confront, right, racialized traumas in those spaces. If y'all could speak to that as well.
Yeah, I'm teaching this semester History of the Black Church in North America. And I had a student who he pastors, he's an African-American student, but he pastors a white congregation. And he asked the question, first day of class, we're going through the syllabus, why, how is this course going to help me? I'm not even preparing for ministry in that context. I don't plan to come back to the context. And so why would I, besides the requirement for graduation, why would I need to take this course? And I told him that I thought that I actually told him that I think you probably need this course more than anyone, because your ministry is the ministry of opening the eyes of the blind, to raising the consciousness for people, and becoming a channel by which consciousness can be raised through the kinds of events that you foster, the kinds of preaching that you do around the topics that are around things that are happening in the world. And so I think that the education is a very important part of that, and being open to voices from across lines, and allowing them to speak into the life of the congregation.
What I have done, and I have done workshops and retreats for white congregations, and and especially with trauma and generational trauma, you can frame it. It's not just African American. You can expand it to other groups, including European, to look at their own trauma. And in that conversation, there's connection. There's beginning to be open up empathy for people, because they can see the similar story. It might not be the identical story, but the same feeling. So I have found, working with white churches, that incorporating other groups has opened them up to understand better and have a better understanding of what racialized trauma is and what it looks like.
Our congregation has partnered with a sister church, predominantly white church, in doing certain book reads and discussions. But what has come out of that work is realization from the white church around the impact or their participation in the racialized traumas that have happened, but also a level of vulnerability to have conversation around ways to repair or to do things differently. And I think that it has been fruitful because there's been a level of trust that has been developed. So the conversation has gone deeper than just surface. It's gone to personal stories and just ways in which we feel called to journey together in healthy ways in order to create change.
One of the things that I created in the RAFA, the Contemplative Healing Prayer Program, was to talk about and teach and incorporate on healing prayer. And as we walk through the readings and conversations, at the end, we would also do prayer for each other. And that deepened the healing. And it also allowed, as we moved through the course, they opened up more, everybody opened up more and more, and you could see the connections being made spiritually through the praying for each other and the healing that was happening on a deeper level, and the connections that were being made. So you have to have a group. You have to have a group that wants to do that, though. These folks have to be motivated themselves to want to do the work. And but it can be very profoundly healing and transformative.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, are we addressing these questions of racialized trauma in seminaries? Wink, wink, Dr. Paula, who I know has taught a course on this, but is this on the whole a part of seminary curriculums? And then as a result, what might pastors or leaders need in order to address these particular challenges in their context and congregation?
Well, most recently being in the DMIN program, and also not too long ago, it feels like it hasn't been that long, but it's been a little while. was in the MDiv program. I will say I have seen growth at Union and the intentionality of addressing racialized trauma and intentionality around just bringing more voices into the conversation in regards to womanist voices. I'm grateful for the Womanist Center, the Center for Social Justice and Reconciliation, that's been doing a lot of work. But I realize overall seminaries do have a lot of work to do in order to broaden the scope and deepen the work around addressing trauma. I did want to also notate Dr. Parker's class that she teaches, and I think that it should be incorporated in curriculums everywhere, but I know she can't like move around all these different places. But she talks about trauma and transfigured Christian faith, and then womanist mystics too, because the womanist mystics have been doing this work for years and years, centuries. So I think that a part of what pastors and leaders need to address these challenges are around the education and also the healing modalities. I particularly like the mystical ways in which we heal, connecting to the spirit in the various ways that we can do that. You know, Howard Thurman is a huge transformative voice in the mystical space, but also there are other Black women, Barbara Holmes, who's doing amazing work with her Crisis Contemplation book. There's Dr. Parker with Roots Matter, who has done and continues to do amazing work. So I think that we need to educate ourselves around more of those womenist voices that have done the work, continue to do the work, and it's been so fruitful and can be embedded within our congregation. I mean, seminaries, but also congregations eventually as we train people.
Yeah, I would say that having taught in different kind of seminary contexts, that I think even the matter of race sometimes is hard to even come up in some of these seminaries. I have seen schools begin to require that all of the faculty require that all course syllabi lift up different voices, which I think is a wonderful start. And then, of course, at a place like Duke, where they require every student that comes through their Master of Divinity program, maybe all master's programs, to take a course that deals with, in some way, with race. I think that's a good model to really get people to begin to even, think about race as they prepare to serve the church. But I think that we have a ways to go.
I think that's helpful in terms of thinking about new approaches in terms of theological education and what might we need to include in our curriculums in order to prepare students and the next generation of faith leaders for the world that they will encounter. Should have been already encountered, because race has been an American social problem since its formation. But yet and still should certainly be attending to this question and reality in a contemporary moment. I recognize that we are almost at the end of our conversation tonight, but I want to get a sense from the three of you. What would be a vision of wholeness in the face of collective trauma? King's last statement, or one of his last writings, where do we go from here? Or kind of another way of asking that is, how do we get there towards this vision of wholeness in the face of collective trauma?
to be honest, I think there's got to be an intentional focus on the spirit and prayer at a depth that, yeah, because I do believe the spirit is the common thread through all of this that's going to hold it together. So as people become more mystical, if you want to say that, but have that encounter that grounds them so that they can do the work that their soul must have and be fueled by that. I think that's the vision that's what I would like to see, more and more people doing their work. Because if people do their work, then we will get there. And it's gonna take a while. It's gonna take a minute. But I do believe that with all my heart, people do the work and allow the love of the presence and the love of God or the Spirit in their experience, that it is transformative and it will change relationships and make them healthier.
I agree with that. Creating, offering healing spaces where people can be brave, to share their story, to open up and process what is happening, guided by the Spirit, because the Spirit knows the avenue, knows the pathway in which we need to take in order to unearth, repair, oftentimes revisit. And Dr. Bessel, the Body Keeps the Score, he talks about being able to revisit in a way that doesn't re-traumatize. So it's a timing thing, and the Spirit knows the timing in which, we are able to revisit that piece and reflect on what happened, but also be comforted in a communal sense, to be guided through the healing process by the Spirit, but in a place that is a brave space where you feel safe to talk about and be vulnerable and go through that process of work that Dr. Parker is talking about. And realizing that it takes time. Mm-hmm. It's not a race. It's paced time, guided by the Spirit. And so as you stay close to the Spirit, and as the Spirit guides you through the work, as the Spirit connects you with, say, a therapist, a spiritual director, a prayer partner, a book that begins to help you to sift through what has happened so that you can reshape that story and remind yourself of how amazing you are, that you're not that thing that happened to you, but you are beloved of God. That's I believe, for me, the vision towards wholeness.
Okay. Thank you both for what you shared. And I do believe that is going to take the work of the Spirit. But also, I think that in the Spirit's work, that I think that that God will raise up people with discernment that can see and that can recognize, and that God would speak to people and give them words to help lead people into another place of wholeness. And I think that there's going to that we're going to have to find a way. I think the human family, the body of Christ, to come together and to explore ways in which we can move forward as a church, as we seek to serve the people. I don't know if it's going to be around projects, but there needs to be some form of coming together. So it's a spirit, but I think it's also this desire of this broad agenda of the Spirit to bring communities and people together as well.
Yes, I'm reminded of that spiritual I open my heart, my eyes, I think my heart to the Lord, and I won't take it back. I will go, I shall go to see what the
That's right.
end will be.
Mhm.
And I think it is a guiding, a prompting, a moving by the Spirit, but it is also us doing the work, as we mentioned, of activating our mind, head, heart, hand, right? Mind, body, soul, in order to confront these structures and powers that exist, to resist, right? But
Mhm.
also a recognition that there is some divine power within us in order to really dismantle these powers that be, in ways that can transform not only the structures themselves, but change our worlds. So I am incredibly grateful for the generous sharing of knowledge that all three of you have gifted us with tonight. And thank you for the work that you're doing in your respective locations. Reverend soon to be Dr. Phanta, we are looking forward to the publishing of your future work, knowing that you are already so dynamite, and we look forward to that work in the world. Dr. Parker, whose work is changing and transforming so many students here at Union, but continues to inform us. Thank you for your witness to the Cannon Center. And Dr. Williams, you are worldwide, Smithsonian National, all around, everywhere, doing the work. So we're thankful for what you're doing, and how we're continuing to learn through you, and how you're supporting and impacting the lives of our larger and broader communities. Thank you to those who've joined us tonight. We are continuing this conversation in February by turning our attention to, I believe, the Hebrew Bible and conversations in the Old Testament in relation to these questions. And I am going to put a personal plug to invite you to future conversations that are forthcoming at the 2023 Spring Conference of the Katie Geneva Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership in Charlotte, North Carolina. The Center for Justice for Social Reconciliation is also having conversations and events that you might look forward to, but stop by the Center for Womanist Leadership.org in order to learn about what we have coming in the near future. Thank you again, and take care.
Thank you, Reverend Jones, and thank you all for watching. Mark your calendars for our next discussion, February 28th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, take care and enjoy the rest of your day.